Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you coming back after lunch and hope you had a wonderful dining experience. I'm Kimberly Andrews. I'm moderating the session, and I'm also going to be facilitating this first presentation, which I'm very excited about. This is a partnership with a youth program, young professionals that we call YoPro in Brunswick, Georgia. And the background of this is a shoreline change and flood monitoring project that Fraser and I initiated in 2016. And originally we looked at this on Jekyll. It was initially funded by Federal Highways Administration and really looking at these critical access points and the stability. We're primarily looking at transportation, but the project has evolved to look at critical infrastructure like wastewater treatment, fire stations, hospitals, recreation areas, and even sensitive ecological habitats. So immediately adjacent to Jekyll on the mainland is Brunswick, Georgia, and we have substantial flooding issues. And by substantial, I mean monthly, multiple times a month. It's pervasive throughout the city of Brunswick. We have compound flooding. On top of that, we have aging infrastructure and maintenance issues. And we've had this opportunity to extend some of this technology to the city to work with both the city and the county, and UGA, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and private engineering firms have been involved in this. And our role has been to provide technical assistance and use this technology to monitor flooding patterns in the city. So recently, Shawn Williams and I, through this program, Coastal Outreach Soccer, you're about to hear all about this, we teamed up to submit a proposal to Georgia DNR and NOAA. It's funded through a coastal incentive grant. And we worked with the young folks in our YoPro program to expand this project to Brunswick. And we got the funding. And you're going to hear all about it. So with that, I am actually going to turn it over to my friends in Brunswick, Georgia, who are going to tell you directly about what they're working on.
Coastal Outreach Soccer is a local nonprofit started to support kids in the city of Brunswick, ages 4 through 18, who are typically unrepresented in athletics. Typically soccer. This is about more than soccer, with the goal of developing well-rounded individuals who also excel in academic excellence, STEM skill sets, and community outreach. Our audience also extends to our parents in the city school system and recreation department. Our Young Professionals Program, or YoPro as we call it, was initiated in 2021 by our Executive Director, Shawn Williams, and Dr. Kimberly Andrews with the UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant as a workforce development program to train us on opportunities and skill sets and STEM career pathways available to us in Southeast Georgia. In 2023, we began the YoPro Leaders Track for high schoolers to lead a service learning project equivalent in rigor to college internships. We received hands-on training with the critical thinking process, field equipment, and analytical software used by the career professionals who mentor us on the active research, engineering, and architecture projects. The picture of my teammate Chayse with a microscope is one of the billboards currently up in Brunswick to help us recruit and raise awareness. Our presentation today focuses on our current work by YoPro leaders and our dedication to addressing the recurring flooding issues in Brunswick. We are working hard on priority sites such as our soccer field at Howard Coffin Park, with plans to implement these solutions across other neighborhoods in Glenn County. Now I'd like to hand it over to my teammate Chayse to tell you all about our work.
Flooding is a serious issue in our community. It damages homes, disrupts small businesses, and affects public spaces like our soccer field at Coffin Park. The larger image shows how compound flooding on Lanier Boulevard impacts Glenn Middle School, making attendance difficult for many students. The smaller image features a bookstore owned by one of our coaches and teammates, where frequent flooding drives away customers and causes property damage. One of our teammates also experiences repeated home flooding, leading to mold, serious health risks like respiratory issues, and ongoing financial strain from having to relocate. We're also concerned about the environmental impacts of flooding. When cars drive through flooded streets like Albany Street, leave behind emissions, oil, and other harmful chemicals. This pollution affects local plants, wildlife, and even our neighbors who live nearby. Flooding is also a complex issue. As shown here, Coffin Park is covered in large puddles and dying grass. In the background, you can see the marsh. This side of town sits at sea level, so when the tide is high, marsh water often overflows into nearby areas with nowhere else to go. We consistently experience compound flooding in Coffin Park and the Windsor Park neighborhood due to the combination of stormwater, runoff, and high tides.
The objectives of YoPro leaders' flood monitoring research and design are to reduce damages to properties, the environment, and the city of Brunswick. To help my teammates and me complete our objective, we will use many forms of technology like game cameras and time-lapse photography and drones to monitor the locations, frequencies, extent, and persistence of flooding. We currently have 18 cameras in the Brunswick grid monitoring a cross-representation of land use types, specifically residential, commercial, small businesses, critical infrastructures such as roads, fire stations, hospitals, and public spaces. This helps us assess flooding patterns on a finer temporal scale and in our work with the city on prioritizing locations for stormwater mitigation. 5 of the sites are currently undergoing construction to deal with flooding. We will be using our camera data to compare pre- and post-construction flooding patterns to determine effectiveness, and will continue working with the city and UGA engineers on any further needs in these and future areas. As you can see, an example of the bookstore location shown earlier, you can see the frequency of flooding from the excerpt of images data covered 5 months, specifically December through May, which is an outside of hurricane season, showing that flood is an issue multiple times a month, with the extent varying relative to precipitation quality and the timing of rainfall relative to the tide cycle and amplitude.
Examples of images from our drone flights are pictured here of recreational features at Coffin Park, the soccer field on the left and the walking track on the right. This park is adjacent to Highway 17, our county's primary road and part of our evacuation route, which is immediately adjacent to the marsh. This coming summer and fall, we will be using ICOET software to stitch together individual drones to create ortho mosaics for data that captures a large spatial extent. We have also been working with local engineers and architects to design swells and bioretention cells for flood mitigation. Bioretention cells not only have the ability to help mitigate flooding, but also can clean out non-point source pollutants in stormwater through the plants and soil. Non-point source pollutants can include some of the following: excess fertilizer, oil, grease, litter, or bacteria from septic systems or pets. The layers of the bioretention cell will include native soil as the bottom layer, the rock above, next would be sand topped with mulch. We use survey equipment and drones and then worked in CAD to design 3 cells that were proposed to the city in the April Commission meeting.
Importantly, we have been emphasizing the need to prevent these problems before construction in our presentations to and interactions with city commissioners. This involves planning ahead, developing engineering plans before construction, and basing those plans on local input and scientific data, on physical features and any current flooding patterns. Further, unless the proper timelines and resources are dedicated to planning, we will continue to face these same challenges repeatedly, which end up being more effective and usually not completely resolvable once problematic development is in place.
We need the support from everyone who says young people like us do not care about anything but our phones and social media. To those individuals who can hear my voice today, my teammates and I stand ready to continue to serve our community with our actions. We also need the support from our city and county commissioners and our mayor to give us feedback and implement our design solutions for the city of Brunswick. For the ICOET attendees who are here today, please prioritize the time to engage young professionals so we are actively training our generation, who is going to be responsible for bringing new voices and new perspectives for new approaches and new solutions. And from the transportation community, we could use your insight and expertise on this project. We'll gladly accept more information and ideas from you to help.
I would like to give thanks to our many local partners at UGA, the city engineers, landscape architects, and H2O Creative Group who assist with our graphic design and marketing. We couldn't do this work without our funding support from DNR and NOAA, Honeywell, and our COS donors. And thank you to our teammates, families, and coaches, and thank you for listening. We will take any questions from the audience with our remaining time.
Thank you, guys. That was great. Any questions from in-person or online audience? Okay, is there anything that you would like to add, Brunswick? Well, thank you so much for visiting us at ICOET in Denver. Keep up the good work. Danielle, are you with us?
Yeah, hi Kimberly. Hi
We
to
missed
you
you.
all.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah, nice to be here virtually at least.
Yes, thank you so much for contributing. This is Danielle Gamboa. She's coming to us from Costa Rica with Panthera. And she's going to be presenting to us today on her Coalition of Women. Bring it, girl.
Hi, nice afternoon. Nice to be here. Yes, as Kimberly said, I'm going to share with you this initiative. It's of a coalition of women assisting Costa Rica to build wildlife-friendly roads. It has been a great adventure. Working together from different backgrounds have been an amazing adventure. So I'm going to share it with you all. I'm going to start explaining where is Costa Rica and how is Costa Rica for you to understand how we deal with things here. It's a tiny country in America between North and South America, 5 million people, no army. Most of the territory, 24%, is under protection, national parks protected, and many other types of protected areas. We have a very high diversity of fauna and flora, and we also have to deal with a high density of road infrastructure. So that's for you to know how is Costa Rica and to have a better idea. So many years ago, we started working together. We didn't plan it, and this team has no official confirmation, is not attached to the Ministry of Transportation, neither the Ministry of Environment. It's just a group of people trying to push environmental actions to reduce the impact of roads in Costa Rica. I'm going to, Kimberly, you did a great work. I'll do it next time, but I didn't invite them. I'm just going to explain or present them for you today. Karina, it's like my fairy godmother because she has been supporting all the topics, the guidelines we have made for the country. So she's an environmental and social, working on environmental and social standards. It's a senior consultant. She is Susana. It's great, a great road ecologist. She works in the ground with government projects. She is great pushing things, even though in a very difficult environment for women. She's working great on the ground and supporting the implementation of measures. Then Evelyn Solano, she works for the Wildlife Agency. She is in charge of bringing animals hurt on roads to the rescue centers. That's me. I work for Pantera. I'm in charge of the Wildcats Friendly Roads Project, focus on recommending measures for the government to reduce the impact of roads on wildlife. That's Esther. She is great, a great representative from rescue centers. She's a biologist and she is rescuing wildlife from roads, and also collecting data. She has been collecting data for many years, and that data is positioning roads as a main threat to wildlife in Costa Rica. She's Esmeralda. Esmeralda is a professor at the university. She has a road ecology project, and she has been training a lot of new students that are doing a great job gathering data to understand the impact of roads. She's Angie. Angie is a great professional with a lot of work. She represents the Ministry of Environment, and she's in charge of wildlife as a national level. And she's always supporting and opening doors for us for training wildlife officers in all around the country. She is Katia. Katia has a special work. She's a biologist in a non-biologist environment. She works for the Ministry of Transportation, and It's a few biologists, a team of a few biologists that is holding together all the environmental issues on this ministry. She's Andrea. Andrea for me is a hero. She works for the Ministry of Transportation, advising the minister and on environmental issues. She is like turning down fires all around the Ministry of Transportation, trying to implement more measures for wildlife around the country. She is Marcela. Marcela now has a great position. She's in the agency in charge of environmental impact assessments, and she has been working with us for many years together. So she have learned a lot, and now she's in that agency. That is a great opportunity to use all the knowledge she have gathered for environmental impact assessments, mainly on road projects. Katia is from a bank. She represents IDB Bank, and she has been supporting the implementation of measures on road projects supported by this bank. She is Ana Lucia. Ana Lucia represents the United Nations program, and she has been trying to find ways of securing funding for the implementation of underpasses on Costa Rican roads. And now we're going to talk about the achievements of this group. It's important that all these achievements have happened since many years ago. And the topic of road ecology and measures for wildlife on roads have been secured because in the Ministry of Transportation, there's an agency focused of working hand by hand with many other actors on securing measures for wildlife on roads. Since 14 years ago, they have been supporting this topic in the Ministry of Transportation. This team of this coalition of women made the first gathering many years ago because many roadkills were around the country. So this group made the first gathering to address the impact of roads on wildlife. Also, 12 years ago, this group started a database of wildcats dead on roads. Now we have achieved like 600 wildcats dead on Costa Rican roads, from jaguars, cougars, oncillas. All the 6 species are found dead on Costa Rican roads. Also, this group made the first symposium on road ecology for Costa Rica. This group also made the Wildlife Friendly Roads Guide. This guide was given to the Ministry of Transportation for them to start implementing measures on new roads, mostly. Then we made a course. It was a nice course because it was for Costa Rican and also for Mesoamerican countries to start learning and implementing measures for wildlife. Most of new road projects are secured by the guide, but old projects that has no environmental impact assessment where they didn't have any measure for wildlife. So we support the government and mostly the maintenance agency for them to start implementing measures on existing roads, because maintenance agencies are the ones that are in charge of all roads in Costa Rica. We made a guidelines for general public for them to have information and can support the implementation of measures in a general way for the country. And we also made the National Wildlife Inventory for underpasses. We travel around the country, gather information of the structures for the Ministry of Transportation for them to have an inventory, and also to see the progress on the country using an indicator, the underpasses. This group have shared the experience of Costa Rican guidelines and books. We made a training, a very important training, because most of the roads in Costa Rica are still gravel roads, and they are the agency in charge are local governments. So we made a training for local governments because they are turning most of these gravel roads into paved roads. And they need to know how they can mitigate the future impact of those paved roads, mostly because they are related to protected areas or close to protected areas. We did a virtual course on road ecology for Mesoamerica, mostly for government representatives, and it's available and it's free. We are supporting a new law that is being developed. This new law will make environmental measures mandatory for wildlife, for roads in the country. And the guide, remember the guide I talked previously, that guide has many years, is very old, and we have advanced as a country on many new experience. We have new experience of many new topics, maintenance, monitoring. So we were looking for funding for the elaboration of, or turning the guide into a manual and update all the information we have gathered. And this year, at the beginning of this year, the funds were secured. Right now, the Ministry of Transportation has funding to elaborate this new manual that is going to be also mandatory for the ministry. That's mostly the report from Costa Rica. That's the main activities this group have been doing for many years. But we're also trying to make new coalitions. We have made new coalitions in the Mesoamerican region through training, through supporting them. Also in Latin America through a Transport Working Group for Latin America by the UCN. We are also working together for a safe ground. And also we're trying to make also bring this effort to beyond. Kimberly's part also from this team, and we are calling many women around the world for gathering and sharing their experience and supporting each other. Thanks a lot, and if you have any questions, I'm available.
Thank you, Daniela. We have about 7 minutes for any questions or discussion with Daniela. How many people in the room have been to Costa Rica?
I guess I have a question.
Okay, great.
What's your inventorying your underpasses, or, and so what's the status of that, but you're getting general?
Good question. I made a presentation early this morning on the inventory. We visited 7 routes around the country on 2023. But we choose just to include in the inventory the underpasses that were already finished and in operational phase. So we gathered 40 underpasses around the country. There were others that were under construction, so we need to find out which ones we were going to include. So we choose the ones that were operational. So we have 40 underpasses around the country, most of them square, most of them dry, but some of them are for wildlife and water too.
Yeah,
we didn't start the arboreal crossing inventory because we have a lot of them and we have no budget, so that would be in the future.
Yeah, I have a follow-up on that, if you don't mind. So you have water culverts for water. Do you know the wildlife using those existing?
Yeah, that was the first type of monitoring we did. Many researchers did in the country. And the first study monitoring culverts was great, was big, and was between national parks. So that first study gave us a lot of information of which kind of structure was favored for cougars or which one for armadillos. And that was great. I have been working for 4 years in a old road between national parks that has a lot of culverts, and we start cleaning them because they were blocked. And after we clean them, many animals start using them during dry season. But now we are using that information for the maintenance agencies, because at least if they clean them, they will be available for wildlife, not during rainy season, but for dry season. So we are monitoring culverts too.
Yeah, my work I do in my area is primarily focused on like prey species using culverts. So what types of culverts are you seeing that are having success for your big cats? Is there a specific like correlation that you're seeing, or is it just kind of what's available?
Kimberly, can you help me? I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, let me walk the mic back.
Hi, so my main question was, so when I'm looking at wildlife underpasses, it's primarily for like prey species. And I'm just curious where you're working with big cats, if you're seeing correlation with certain types of structure being more successful for the crossing.
Sorry, I can't understand. It's because the sound is not too good.
Yeah, I can repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, please. I hear you. Great.
Is there a type of underpass you're seeing with success for big cats?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I my focus was on wildcats. So, okay, we have a lot of culverts, and during monitoring culverts, we have found jaguars using culverts, big culverts, culverts with not too much water, 3 meters per 3 meters square. That's the structures that jaguars are using in a very heavy traffic roads, 4 lanes. But we have also documented jaguars using underpasses, small ones, but in a low traffic road, a road that is just for geothermal extraction energy, close to a national park. So that's the information we have now. For cougars, we have 2 by 2 meters structures used by cougars. We have tapirs also using 2 by 2 structures in low traffic roads. But yeah, the big cats we have are jaguars and cougars. We have some small cats that still are not using any structure. For example, the margay, that is an arboreal cat. We have no evidence of them crossing safely in culverts, in underpasses, arboreal crossings. We have no evidence yet for them. But we have oncillas, the most endangered species of wildcat in Costa Rica. We have them using culverts in high elevation oak forests.
I haven't worked with like anything.
Oh, okay. Awesome. We have another minute and a half if anyone else has a question for Daniela. Okay. Let's see if there's a
Hello. Okay.
I can just try to repeat the question.
Yeah, I need translation, please.
But do you have a single form of advice for setting up, establishing a new partnership? What was it great?
Do you have a single form of advice for establishing a partnership?
Okay, yeah. It's interesting because at the beginning we were targeting or looking for people in very important places in the Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Environment to work with them. But what we have found is that you just need someone committed to wildlife, and that's all you need, because in most of these agencies, the people that have pushed the topic for many years are not in high positions, are not very influential, but they are secured for a long term. Their commitment is secure for a long term. So that's what we are looking for, people committed, and it doesn't matter where are they from, which is their background. If they're committed for wildlife and making roads safe for wildlife, that's all we need.
Thank you so much, Daniela. We hope to see you next ICOET.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Bye.
Next up, we have Rick Black presenting on resiliency in the face of adversity, a tale of climate change, or as we safely call it now, the Delta climb.
Yeah.
Do you want to be
Yeah, sure.
infrastructure, ecological mitigation, and collaboration? So you're going to give us all the answers, right?
All the answers. So let me start off. As recently as March of this year, United Nations put forth their annual report. We know a lot of this stuff. Let's set the background here real quick. Are you okay without me using a mic? I know everybody in my family says, please, no mics. So we see that 2024 is the first calendar year to be more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial era. And you can see all of these things we see that we hear in the news if we believe in the cult of science. The past 10 years were identified as the individual 10 warmest years on record. We've got ocean heat going up. We've got the Atlantic where hurricanes are forming with big storms. We've got the global mean sea level rising. We see that all of North America's glaciers are going at a rate that's unprecedented. We see all these things happen. Sorry, I talk a lot. So here in Colorado, over 122-year record, look at the temperature anomalies. So you can see through the early 1900s, it was a lot cooler.
Sorry.
That's all right. We can guess what I'm going to say next. Over the more recent times, we've had a lot hotter temperatures. Thing I'd like you to look is this light gray line is the trend over the full record, but look at that dark gray line. We'll come back to it in a second. Could you advance for me?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we also have a lot of large wildfires in the western United States. And we see all of these trends are increasing. Next one, please. But in Colorado, look at the large wildlife trend. These are numbers of Colorado wildfires that have burned over 10,000 acres over the last 40 years. So you can see how rapidly they're growing. Next, please. Remember that old trend line for the temperatures? That's not too dissimilar of a trend line for the fires. Next. Okay. You can just read the stuff to the right. The trend continues. It's obvious. 20 of the largest 20 wildfires in 20 years, 16 of the largest in the last 13, 9 in the last 3 years, 4 in the last 3 years. These things are getting more frequent and huge. Okay, let's change to a different disaster. As our air temperatures rise, for every 4 degrees Fahrenheit, or every 1 degree Fahrenheit, we get 4% more water in the air. That means when the water comes out, it's flashier. Next. Here in Colorado, we're losing a lot of our snowpack. You lose that reflective heat, right? We start getting this sensible heat release. We get a lot more evapotranspiration. We get a lot more little ephemeral streams, and then we get a much larger focused discharge. So I don't know if anybody here is from Colorado, but where people like to live is here. Here we got the steep slopes, we got the fast running, first, second order rivers. Down here, we don't quite have the big, deltas and the Mississippi plains. That's where the deposition zone is. So our rain intensity is increasing over the whole country. We're getting flashier and more intense rains. We're getting landslides and families displaced, isolation of communities, crop damages. We also see that they're getting flashier and flashier. That's this year, and these are projected in the next 15 years and the next 30 years. Look how much of the continental US is getting darker and darker blue. So we've seen this here in Colorado. These flooding changes, flashier floods, we're getting higher rivers, we're getting the erosion coming from these flashier floods. Couple things I find absolutely scary is the 1,000-year flood will occur more often due to heavy precipitation, and the 20-year return floods. The 20-year floods are expected to be returning every 2 to 3 years. So we've seen this if you live here. Here's along section 133. We've got washouts, we've got erosion in this one to the right. Next, please. So we've got increase in surface temperatures, increase in air temperatures, increase in wildfires, size and intensity, increase in flashy rain events. We got erosion, landslides, floods, damage to habitat, damage to infrastructure, and communities being isolated. So how do we predict, prioritize, and reduce all of these impacts from all these things that are happening and still protect our infrastructure and our wildlife habitat? So here's a case study in Massachusetts and Vermont. I'm going to swap geographies a little bit. So it was just like Danielle said, we've got to build these coalitions and get this cooperation amongst agencies. We had a bunch of different agencies on this one. So the approach here was to look at a fluvial geomorphic principle, get a large-scale desktop analysis and a field verification, get an asset management system, and then again, support with education. So next, in Vermont, they started with getting this transportation resiliency planning tool. But here's something that just kind of blew my mind. Vermont has a complete inventory of every waterway, creeks, rivers, streams. They've got a complete inventory of every bridge. So if you take the rivers, wherever there's a road crossing, and delete the bridges, those have got to be culverts. They had no culvert inventory. So we started off by inventorying all the culverts. Now, for Colorado, that's kind of Vermont's the size of one of your DOT regions, right, or districts. But for the whole state, next please, one more. So we started off looking at the fluvial geomorphic principles to understand the process. So the first things that were looked at was stream power and percent bankful width. So let's look at stream power first. So stream power, we understand how the streams are ordered and how they're distributed. But in Vermont, over 50% of the streams are first order streams. Next. But people don't live at the very headwaters. We got roads adjacent to these streams. We get a much higher percentage of the roads next to these big streams. And then down here, you've got your big, giant wide rivers. Next. Well, look where the damage to infrastructure comes. It's not when you've got the biggest, powerful rivers. It's not where you got these coming straight down because you don't have as many roads next to it. It's right in the middle. Because this is where we've got culverts that are undersized, where people are living, where we've got small bridges, not big bridges that expand whole giant rivers. Next, we looked at bankful width. It's pretty easy. Next, please. It's pretty easy to understand bankful width. If you've got a stream this size and your culvert is that size, you have 50% bankful width, probably not sufficient. They looked at everything from fully compatible to fully incompatible and started rating things on different geomorphic structures. So you can see at the bottom, that's fully compatible with the system. The top one is fully incompatible. So they put it in this large scale desktop analysis and they did a field verification of all the culverts. I think this is so fabulous. 56,000 miles of road, 17,000 miles of stream, 6,000 culverts, and 3,100 bridges. So then they applied those geomorphic structures to bankful width. And we're looking at both bridges and culverts here on which ones are undersized or sized adequate. So, exposure. The degree of stress that an asset is subject to. How big the river is, how strong it is. Sensitivity is it a little teensy toothpick bridge or is it a big strong bridge that can withstand it? So vulnerability is a function of exposure and sensitivity. So they looked at vulnerability and they looked at inundation, erosion, and deposition to look at the different vulnerability types from complete no damage projected with increased floods to all the way up to complete failure. We get it. We know what these look like. Here's deposition, erosion, inundation. In 1983, in my hometown, Salt Lake City, Utah, we had a 1,230-year event. We had flooding so badly that people were kayaking down State Street in downtown Salt Lake and catching fish from those sandbag rivers. These we can just flash through inundation and erosion. You can just see the difference. These are just every couple days. So they apply these vulnerability indices. Vulnerability is that exposure and sensitivity. And they put with inundation, erosion, deposition. And then they applied all of these. They applied a myriad of indices. I love some of these. I should put some arrows on some the specific stream power, the substrate size of the watershed, all of these come into this vulnerability analysis. Then they looked at what percentage in Vermont of culverts met these different undersized criteria. 70% of them were under 50% sized. Only 10% or 75% are better. I don't think that's a shock to anybody who drives roads and sees culverts. Next. This is the scary part. Out of the low vulnerability, 3 are expected in the next 40 years to move to moderate. 3 are going from low to high, or 15 low to high, and 119 from moderate to high. So let's look at risk. Risk is that vulnerability we just talked about times criticality. Criticality is who are we impacting? My wife and I visit Manhattan relatively often. And I was looking out the window one day and saw all of these emergency response vehicles that weren't getting very far. I turned to my wife and said, this is not where I want my heart attack, right? This criticality of getting emergency services to me or me to emergency services. So let's go back in time a day or two to plate tectonics. When the plates collided, the Wasatch Front screens up. Salt Lake City is sits at 4,500 feet, and we can see 11,000 foot peaks. It rippled down into Denver, right? So Denver has communities in all these little foothills that Salt Lake does not have. You got all these little foothills. Next, please. You got people living in all of these areas here. Salt Lake, it just goes from valley floor to mountains. So criticality. Who are we leaving behind? What critical infrastructure are we isolating when one of these roads go out? Low criticality, you got multiple ingress and egress, right? Moderate, you got multiple ingress and egress, but you got some of them that are highly vulnerable. And of course, high criticality, if you've only got one ingress or egress, or you got multiple and they're all vulnerable. So again, we've got to rate everything. They rated everything 1 to 10, criticality indices. And then they applied them to every single road. So this isn't just undersized culverts and bridges. This is now what critical infrastructure is being isolated if one of those roads or culverts goes out. We have travel impacts, failed trips, excess travel time, isolated areas of roads within this limited travel limit. Anybody remember this? Last year, Francis Scott Key, some of the drive-arounds for people commuting to work were 4 hours. This infrastructure, we had failed trips, excessive travel times, isolated areas. The I-95 couldn't take the traffic. It now went from 50-mile-an-hour average to 30 miles an hour. And the total trips on I-95 increased by 24%. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about on criticality. So they put it into an asset management plan. This is some of my favorite stories. They put it into GeoDot and Massachusetts PIT, not it. And next, they looked at this. Favorite story, application. A small town was going out and doing a rotomill and overlay on some roads. And they had their money, their own municipal monies. And they looked up in Maplet and found that 3 of their culverts were undersized. They applied for grants. The grant money came in to increase the culverts, and they didn't have to pay for the road mill and overlay. They replaced that whole section on grant money and increased their culverts. Some of the nature-based solutions, we've all seen them. Let's flip through this one. The horse restoring the floodplains. I want to get to Meriden Green. Meriden Green, my company's US president grew up in Meriden Green. She said every single storm event, next picture, flooded. Downtown Meriden floods. Next. So this is Meriden Green. This is the downtown. Meriden Green separates relatively affluent with relatively non-affluent people. So they took this Meriden Green. There is, you can't barely see it here. There's an old stream system that runs through it. Designed an entire new community service center, next, with amphitheaters and with these big bridges that span, starting to connect communities. Well, apparently Siri thinks I should go to my Applebee's library. But you see the bridge when it starts flooding, but here's the beauty of it. This was opened up. And because it's all been, there's something like 11 miles of stream that are in concrete. There are downstream, there are 1 endemic species, upstream there are 2. In this system here, there are 13 species of fish that live through here. Once it was daylighted and built rills and rifts and all sorts of fish habitat. Falcon Park is another example. Falcon Park is, I have no idea on this one next. Falcon Park, this roadway flooded often. Next. So this is that roadway. Here's the stream. And they decided to clear this area and make a wildlife habitat. They have 2 species of endangered bird, an endangered frog, a bat, and some plants. So you can flip through these kind of fascist construction. You can see here, when they're building these walls, next picture, one more. This was, they filled this natural stream bed underneath here. So this is the stream coming through, but it just gets better and better. They took all the dead standing and they actually mapped out where they wanted dead standing or dead laying, all for the different species habitat. Okay, next. You can see how it's just progressing. So the river now during flood peak periods comes down and is shunted back into this big wetland reserve. Next. They made sure, I didn't point it out on some of those other natural-based solution ones. Every one of those had dry edges on the side of the stream for wildlife access between. They went from closed culverts to open culverts, so there was light, so wildlife could use it more. Same thing on this one. Next. Next. So this, I want you to watch this spot on a time lapse. So here it is, September 2010. This is the area. All wooded. Next. Okay, this is in the beginning of the structure. Here's where it's starting to fill in just like the design. 2019, I think the next one was leaves off. Here's leaves off, but you can see all of the ponding. So we're not, and here's those structures. So it shunts off the extra water and it protects this whole structure. I think that's about it. Keep going. So, what do we do about all this? I have no idea anymore. When I wrote this, we had grants, we had monies, we had money in the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act. We had $8.7 billion in protect that we could go after. I don't know if it's available. We don't know. But these kind of monies, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Protect Act, all of these are built for us to access. They are for the resiliency of highway transit and climate change, if that still exists or not, and more resilient to natural hazards, including flood and weather events. So it used to be that you get $10 million and you replace a structure. Then it was you get $10 million and you upgrade 3 structures. Now we're looking at risk-based that has a potential of completely connecting wildlife passages again. Just a summary: temperatures, wildfire, precipitation, flooding, and we have a ton of structures that are at risk. So now we're looking at assessing risk and then getting benefits. We all have access to those benefits. Any questions? One more, please. If you have any questions, my contact information. I think we're out of time anyway. A quick one.
Yeah.
With that vulnerability index that Armand worked on, you know who led that? Was it the general group or was it a certain?
My company coordinated with all of those groups and the 2 states to do a statewide assessment of the vulnerability and criticality.
that framework you adopted somewhere else with that?
No,
Or is that something you guys came up with?
it's stuff we came up with in conjunction with that group.
Have you seen it applied, directly applied anywhere else?
Well, we've talked to CDOT and UDOT and WashDOT about it, but it has been applied statewide in Massachusetts, Vermont, and partially in Connecticut.
So it worked out.
It works out, I think. Anything else? Thanks for your time.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Alyssa Patton from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm excited to share about a new road ecology training that we've been developing in partnership with our DOT and Fish and Wildlife Agency partners across the Northeast. You might be using the mic. The mic. Should I just stand closer? Is that better? Okay. Let me know if I need to speak up some more. So I'll plan to give a quick overview of this effort, kind of how it evolved, what inspired it, and then I'll show a quick sort of sneak peek at the video that we've developed called the Northeast Habitats and Highways Training. So just for some quick context, this is part of a much larger focus for the Nature Conservancy. In the East, we are really prioritizing the Appalachians region as one of the most climate resilient and biologically unique landscapes in the world. And so our vision here is for people in nature to flourish with, healthy, connected network of forests and fresh water. So this map shows our Appalachians program region, and then in green is the Resilient and Connected Network, which is the Nature Conservancy's database that helps to identify, areas on the ground that have the characteristics that will likely be more resilient to climate change and also have those natural connections for species movement. And so that data set has really become sort of our conservation blueprint. And so, connectivity is a critical component and one of our key focuses. Just some broad context for connectivity work in the East. In general, we have more diffuse species movements compared to, some more specific migration patterns that may be more common out west or other places. Though, like elsewhere, we are seeing, the northward trend of species movement in response to climate change. And so, thankfully, the Appalachians orientation is well suited for that movement. In general, there's a lot of water in the Northeast and frequent and intense flooding. And so we're often considering connectivity through our road stream crossings where, wildlife tend to follow riparian corridors naturally and where we can also achieve multiple benefits, especially, with respect to climate resiliency and upsizing structures. The East also has a large proportion of privately owned lands, and that can make for a little bit of a complicated conservation puzzle. We obviously also have an earlier development history and higher population densities. And so, we're mostly focused on maintaining and enhancing our existing infrastructure. And it's a vast system. So in red here are all the roads that pass over 10,000 vehicles a day in the Appalachians, which is, widely considered a barrier for most species. So you can see how these major barriers, crisscross the entire region and completely bisect it in many places. We are fortunate in the Northeast in particular to have some great coalitions that have been working together on landscape connectivity for 15 years or more. The Staying Connected Initiative is one of them, a binational public-private partnership that the Nature Conservancy helps to lead across the Northern Appalachians. We also have a regional conference on connectivity and transportation similar to this one here. And so, it's from those existing collaborations that really emerged this idea for enhancing some road ecology resources for transportation professionals and particularly in the Northeast. And so that's kind of what ultimately led to this Northeastern Habitats and Highways training. The goals are to enhance, habitat connectivity awareness and appreciation, inspire practical projects and creative thinking, and facilitate expanded interagency planning and coordination, particularly between DOTs and Fish and Wildlife agencies. So what we produced together with our DOT and Fish and Wildlife Agency partners is a roughly 90-minute online training video that really covers the basic concepts of road ecology, connectivity planning and prioritization tools, wildlife-friendly infrastructure solutions, and information on partnerships and resources and ensuring durability, all featuring successful projects from across the Northeast. So the whole concept of this training was modeled off a successful program created by Vermont Agency of Transportation and Fish and Wildlife Program, Chris Lazar being one of the key founders of that program in the room. And they won a Federal Highways Award for this a few years back. But they have a really robust program consisting of 3 tiers. And so this tier 1, they have an online educational video, which is really similar to what we sort of, updated and recreated for across the Northeast. They then follow that up with these additional tiers, more in-person, field-based learning in tier 2, and then tier 3, which is really a deeper dive on engineering solutions. And so, our hope is that by recreating and expanding on this tier 1 for across the entire Northeast, that we can maybe inspire and lay the groundwork for some more of these, type tier 2 and tier 3 type trainings. A couple of other points about Vermont's program that we'd like to, replicate and build on. Theirs is available to a wide audience, including all levels and departments across agencies, DOTs, and Fish and Wildlife, as well as municipal road crews. All of these audiences are relevant for this new training and perhaps some others, other types of road networks, universities, consulting engineers, etc. Vermont also has their course certified through their state's learning management system, which, really incentivizes participation for professional credits. So that's a model that we definitely would like to look at for the other states as well. And then really, the biggest outcome in Vermont is that it's really increased, understanding and cooperation and trust across agencies, and particularly their DOT and Fish and Wildlife Agency. They've long been a leader in the Northeast on connectivity, and Jens Hilke from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, refers to this program as the single most important thing that they've done to engender culture change in the state. Something like a decade plus into that program, I think, Chris, but you're now seeing, graduates from that program emerge into leadership positions. And so kind of the whole tenor of conversations and really understanding has changed. So with Vermont's model in mind, the Nature Conservancy was fortunate to be able to serve as sort of the convener and collaborator, but really with the goal of this to be agency-led and really prominently feature agency voices and projects. And so to create the new training, we hosted field trips across 18 different transportation sites across 8 different states. And we had nearly 100 partners attend, engineers, wildlife specialists, planners. We looked at a diverse range of wildlife crossings together and also talked about, a wide range of planning frameworks and coordinating structures. Some key lessons that kind of stood out from all of these conversations include, no surprise, the key role of partnerships that enabled many of the success stories. Those included across agencies and with NGOs and other partners as well. We learned about, varying forms, like I said, of communication and collaboration within the states. And so clearly, like, no one size fits all solution, but a lot of great models to learn from and opportunities for improvements and information sharing across states. We heard a lot about the advantages of prioritizing and really communicating the many co-benefits that wildlife crossings can create, including, safety, obviously wildlife and aquatic connectivity, and flood resiliency. One thing that really rang clear was that maintenance and monitoring are sorely lacking across the entire region, which was a bit of an eye-opener for me. As one of our DOT partners put it, we often build these structures and then there isn't funding for maintaining them, and then we forget about them. And so that was a clear need to be thinking about that early on and factoring that into project planning. And then lastly, a couple more points. We saw, the value of and the need for some more regional information sharing, getting the word out about successful projects. I think a number of us on the production team have been, working for years on connectivity in the Northeast and hadn't heard of a lot of these projects. And so, not only sharing success stories, but also some of the practical details that are often hard to come by for the implementers, like the designs, the specifications, cost estimates, those types of things. And then lastly, there did seem to be a huge opportunity to really expand on these trainings with additional tiers like Vermont does, for example. But getting out in the field together in particular was really highlighted as a rare opportunity to really, see this stuff and experience it firsthand, especially for, certain individuals that with, departments that may not get out as much as the environmental staff, or between agencies that may not get to interact as much otherwise in those settings. So just getting out in the field for the filming was really beneficial. So with that overview, I'm excited to show just sort of a sneak peek of our new training video. So the full video, like I said, is about an hour and a half. We've broken it into 5 different modules. So I'm just going to show the first module, which is the short introduction to give you a flavor.
We as a society in the US are spending $10 billion with a B dollars a year on the issue of wildlife vehicle collisions.
DOT is a transportation agency for sure, but we're also part of a state government that values quality of life. It's not as simple as it puts the pavement on the road, right? There's more to, what our involvement is with what everybody cares about.
Here at NISET we have an environmental ethic that runs throughout. It's even in our mission statement. Transportation in an environmentally sound manner. And I really take that to heart.
This is our backyard, this is our landscape. We want to be resilient for our current generation and future generations of people and wildlife to really enjoy what it is like living here in the Northeast.
So I think there are, multiple benefits from incorporating larger structures and trying to better accommodate wildlife crossings. We want to get as much benefit for the investment that we're doing as we can. And if that benefit is both, serving the road and the environment that it goes through, then that's a win-win.
Hi, I'm Jim Andrews, a herpetologist and road ecologist from Vermont. I've been asked to help share with you what transportation and wildlife professionals in the northeastern U.S. are doing to minimize the impact of transportation infrastructure on wildlife and ecosystems and improve motorist safety.
Sure, yeah, this particular location is in Royalston, Massachusetts.
Over the summer and fall, we have spoken with nearly 100 engineers, wildlife specialists, and ecologists from New Jersey to Maine. And as a result, we have gathered a unique collection of information, including many success stories from your peers in this region.
The road mortality for our target species declined precipitously.
Yeah, and anything that
I recognize that the species of concern are part of this overall ecosystem and contribute to a healthy ecosystem. And a healthy ecosystem helps flooding and helps water quality and helps all of the aspects of overall wellness of the area. So I think having wildlife crossings contributes to that.
This whole project, the Habitats and Highways filming and training, originated from our transportation agency partners. We've come to find out that just sharing information has been so valuable. Peer-to-peer exchange between transportation agencies, sharing best practices and information. So we're hoping that through projects like this, we can round up all of the amazing knowledge that already exists, across the Northeast and borrow from elsewhere in the country and package it together and so that it's accessible for, transportation agencies.
We hope this information will be useful to you in your efforts to sustain wildlife populations, maintain connectivity, and improve safety in your state. We are encouraged and excited by the many efforts we have observed in our travels, and we sincerely hope that the conversations and lessons learned in the following videos have the same impact on you and your colleagues. This Habitats and Highways training has been developed into these 5 modules that can be watched all at once or at your own pace. A sincere thank you to the many individuals and organizations that helped make this project possible.
Credits run with a long list of partners and individuals that contribute. So really grateful to all of these people. So the full package of videos, all 5 modules is currently being reviewed by our agency partners, and we hope to finalize them within the next few weeks, at which point we will post to the Nature Conservancy's YouTube channel, so available publicly for partners or others to use as they choose, and maybe inspire some similar efforts elsewhere. So thank you. Time for questions. Renee?
I have a question. I know at one point, Federal Highways, I think, was looking at doing some workforce development, professional training coming out of the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act requirements. I'm curious as to whether they've expressed, potential interest in maybe building on this or using it as kind of a template, if you will.
I'd say that was our hope, that we could have those conversations. It did come up at the last conference we were at, I think you were at too, the Northeast Transportation and Wildlife Conference, and they expressed interest there. Given the craziness that they're going through right now, we've yet to be able to really connect on that. Chris, I know Jens Hilke had reached out about that opportunity as well. So we're still hopeful that there would be interest in doing that, because it does seem like there's really good alignment with what they've been tasked to do, right? And while it features Northeast examples, I do think it's relevant much wider than that, or at least could serve as a model for how you do that in other places, and bringing in some of the more local examples. Yeah, Chris.
Once it's on the TNC YouTube channel, are you going to do some like proactive advertising? Are you going to target some audiences?
Yeah, well, we'd love your feedback on that. For starters, the primary focus is getting feedback from the DOTs and the people that we hope this will impact the most. And then from there, yeah, collaboratively, we'd love to find a way to promote it as everyone agrees that would be best. I think there's a lot of different purposes that it could be used for, fundraising, just general communications. A lot of other uses have been brought up beyond just, transportation professionals. So yeah, I would love to think about more options.
Maybe target leadership at DOTs.
Yeah, we realized that leadership staff may not watch an hour and a half of videos, but by breaking it into the different modules was the hope that it's a little more accessible, and at least, you know, the introduction video is like easy enough to share at higher levels. So yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
I work in the Intermountain West, and I've noticed a lot of how in the more rural areas, the DOT staff and they maybe don't get the chance or don't have access to a lot of information about what they can do, sort of go in to assist. And I'm curious, you know, do you hear touch on any examples like that, you know, where those kind of staff have learned something that, you know, they can do to support that, you know, maybe not in grand structure.
Yeah.
One thing, grand structure.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of the Northeastern examples are like that, right? You know, they're the sort of more practical solutions. And so we did try to feature those quite a bit, examples of real projects in the training. So yeah, hopefully that you know, rings true for that. Yeah.
So I'm an engineer and it's kind of the opportunity, but are you planning to give grant credits to engineers to go and take the webinar and get more champions internally with DOTs and consulting engineers who do that?
Yeah, that is the goal, and that's what you do in Vermont, right, Chris? You have from my limited understanding is that there's different requirements in every state. So we're trying to kind of navigate what is required and what the process is to go through for each of the 8 states that are involved, but that would be the hope. I've heard that. Okay. I have heard that New York DOT though can assign credits themselves. They're an entity, so yeah, all that stuff is yeah, we need to dive deeper. Thank you.
Thank you to Layla for running our test.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. Happy Monday. First day of ICOET. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks and welcome to Denver. We're so excited to have you all here. So we're going to go ahead and kick it off and get started here today. If you don't know where you are, this session is I Think I'm Being Followed. And we have 4 speakers. Our first speaker is going to be virtual. His name is Chris Kerfoot, and I hope I pronounced that more or less accurately, Chris. You can correct me if you need to. And he is giving a talk on using an automated radio tracking system as a novel approach to the landscape scale assessment and monitoring of bats on a UK-based linear infrastructure project. And so we will turn it over to Chris.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hopefully you can see the presentation. Good afternoon. My name's Chris Kerfoot. I'm also here with my colleague Charlotte Webble. We're going to be talking about an automated radio tracking system that we use to monitor the bat movements during construction of a major UK linear infrastructure project. And I can click on the slides. There we go, sorry. Brief agenda of what we'll cover, but you'll find that out as we go. So the project itself is called HS2, and it's a new high-speed passenger rail line being built between London and Birmingham in England, and it's approximately 160 miles long. And I think it's still the biggest construction project in the whole of Europe, so it's a big project. We've been working with a contractor who's building one section of this scheme, and within that section we have an area called the Colne Valley. And the Colne Valley is an area of lakes and rivers and woodland and nature reserves, and the whole area is crossed by the new railway as it's supported on a new viaduct that's being built, which is the picture at the bottom of the screen. So due to the sensitivity of the Colne Valley, longer term monitoring was required to detect changes in the bat populations arising from the potential impacts from construction and eventually operation. It's not quite at operation yet, but the construction's almost finished for this section. Given the size and scale of the project, monitoring had to be done at more of a landscape scale. So to help meet these objectives and robustly test the impacts at a landscape scale, radio tracking was proposed as the best method to do that. Now, traditional radio tracking has some inherent constraints. It's usually very labour intensive, which makes it costly. And there's also health and safety implications through having teams of people working long hours through the night. And those risks are exacerbated when you're doing that in and around major active construction sites. And you're also limited by the number of bats that it's actually possible to effectively follow in any one radio tracking session. So we decided to use an automated system. We thought it was going to be the best option for our site, and it was going to help us meet our monitoring objectives. So the system we used is made by a company called Placotus Solutions, and they're based in Germany. And we had an array of logger units set up across our site. Each unit had 4 directionally sensitive aerials mounted on top of a mast that were then connected to a receiver. And the whole thing was remotely accessible, so we could configure the system and download the data without having to actually visit the station every day. The data loggers record the signal strength for each aerial. Then software calculates the directional bearings based on the aerial that received the strongest signal. The kit is very delicate and requires precise setting up and calibration, but once it is set up, it will record constantly 24/7, and it also records a broad frequency range. So it meant that we were never limited by the number of tags, radio tags that we could use in any radio tracking session. So we've caught our bats, we've fitted them with the radio tags, which is the fun bit, and then we want to see the data. So the software allows us to go in and isolate the frequency for each tag. We can then download that data and filter out the noise. Now we did receive some of our locations receive more noise than others. It's a big active construction site. There are site offices throughout, and that did generate noise that we had to get rid of. So we'd go through the data and filter out the noise. Once we'd cleaned it up, we could then use the software to calculate the directional bearings. And where we had two of the logger stations or more of the logger stations that received the same time-stamped signal, we knew that the triangulated point was then at the intercept between the bearings from both of those readings. Where just one of the aerials or logger units had picked up the signal, we had a really good idea about the direction of the bat, but we were less certain of the distance of the bat from the receiver. So we used the strength of the signals to approximate the distance, and we have to be really careful with this because there's lots of things that will affect the strength of the radio signal. So atmospheric humidity, obstacles in the landscape, the orientation of the tag to the receiver, and also the battery life of the tag will all affect the strength of the radio signal received. So to try and improve the accuracy of this, we did some manual radio tracking alongside the automated system to just get some measure of calibration to help us interpret those single bearings. And one of the unexpected benefits of using this system that we had no idea about was that we were going to be able to spy on bats whilst they were in their roosts. So where we have a tagged bat that returns to a roost that's within detection range of one of our aerials, we can see what the bat's doing based on the signal strength. So the graph at the top is showing us relatively constant signal strength, which is the bat in the roost. And then we can see the actual point the bat emerges from the roost because the signal strength jumps up, and then we can see it's active and it's flying around and it heads in a particular direction. It comes back and it goes back into the roost, and so on and so on. And we've got hundreds of these little behavioral insights into how bats actually use their sort of collective roosting resource of a site that we just wouldn't have been able to have gathered using any other system because it isn't recording continuously like the one we are using. So on to results. We did a little bit of a side-by-side comparison just to see how effective the manual method is versus an automated method. And you can see the number of triangulations and bearings is far higher using the automated method compared to manual. Consequently, we identified far more roosts using the automated system because we had far better and more of it location data. And this is largely due to the fact the automated system is only limited by the battery life of the tag. So as long as the bat stays within the detection range and the tag is working, the system is continuously hoovering up all those radio signals, so we're getting huge amounts of data. And we've had a few bats where the tag lasted nearly 25 days, and the bat stayed in the area the entire time. So we have constant activity monitoring for these bats over that time, which has been really interesting to see that level of detail. And we've been using this method for the last 3 years. Just really broadly, we can see that the number of bats trapped in each of the 3 years has been increasing, which is really good. In 2021, that was the year a lot of the woodland had to be felled to make way for the scheme, so there was a huge amount of disturbance. And looking at this data, we can see that it's perhaps suggestive that bats are coming back into the area now that the disturbance has changed. But it's not quite that simple, and we wouldn't have realised that without the automated system. If we look at the average bearings per bat, we can see in 2023 that although we had more bats trapped, the actual bearings per bat was far lower than it was in 22, and it was again in 2024. And we think this is due to the specific construction activities that were taking place in 2023. So although we had more bats on site, they were spending far less of their time using that as a resource. And again, we wouldn't have been able to have figured this out without this as a method. And now I'm going to hand you over to Charlotte to go through the rest of the slides.
Thank you, Chris. So what does this mean for, what does all this data mean for the flight lines, the habitats and the roosts on site? So with such large amounts of data, you can see that it provides fairly clear flight line information of how and where the bats travel to on site. And this does feed into the habitat data. So we've got some KDE maps here, so the kernel density estimation, which provides some home range information. You can see that the bats will cross the scheme, which is the line that goes from north to south, sort of slightly hidden under the KDE. And you can see that there's a spread of bat activity, for high density bat activity, slightly to the north of the scheme in some sort of more untouched habitats. But the bats do cross the scheme, and they do sort of, it's permeable to connectivity at this point in time. In addition to this, we found that we were recording much higher numbers of roosts across the scheme and outside the scheme. So you can see the black line going through the centre of the map is the linear infrastructure. That's the viaduct that's being built. And you can see that there's lots of roosts being recorded off site. What was interesting about some of these roosts was that we were detecting a lot more night roosts for the bats. So they were literally hanging up for a couple of hours and then moving on to another night roost, or going off and foraging, or they're going to another night roost and then before zooming off to their like core summer roost or maternity roost during the day at like 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. So none of this would have been detected using manual radio tracking techniques. So what was the success of the automated tracking? So really large quantities of data on and off site. So better data, more likely to detect any changes in the bat activity and have confidence in your findings. We were able to tag and track just significantly more numbers of bats. When you're manual radio tracking, you can only track one bat at a time before you have to switch frequencies, and you're usually in teams of 3 where you want to go and get your triangulations, and that's very, very laborious and a lot slower. So this provides simultaneous data collection for all the tagged bats continuously with no loss of switching between frequencies. So we're then getting better movement data of these individuals because it's so continuous. This gives us really good behavioural insights and understanding of the interactions. We then find information about night roosts and the night roost habits and the roost switching as well. In addition to this, we're able to get really rapid feedback of what's happening on site as well, of any potential impacts or changes. We'll come on to this a little bit more in a second, but we did a few changes to some of the lighting on site to make the site more permeable to Dor Benton's bats. And within a few short weeks, we were able to see those changes with the bats coming back over to site and moving across. They weren't necessarily spending a lot of time, but they were moving across the site, which was important. We were also able to meet the objectives with less survey effort and significant cost savings, and also a reduction in nighttime work, which is a bonus for all of us ecologists, and also the associated journeys with those. So we were having really significant health and safety value added to the project, as well as carbon value added as well. So some of the difficulties, so supply chain complexities with all the kit and the components. So we started this sort of coming towards the end of Brexit, the end of COVID, beginning of Brexit. There were sort of issues with getting commodities into the country, so that was a challenge that we had to face. The kit was delicate, and there was when setting these arrays up, there needs to be a lot of consideration to the location and accessibility of loggers if you need to do any fixes to the loggers or check anything, but also you need to have the loggers so they can talk to each other and connect to each other. So site layout and topography is also important. The systems are complicated, and there are also considerations from the construction noise that need to be given when you're setting up the loggers, and an acknowledgement that software updates do have a small impact to how the data is collected. So we've got software updates every year or so. And that we did use single bearing data in addition to our triangulation data, which is a little bit less precise, but it is part of the wider database that we were collecting. And we would use that information in manual radio tracking as well. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, very much clearer information on the interactions of individuals. So we had Nethusias pipistrelles during the mating seasons. We had 2 males, and they were moving to each other's roosts when the other moved out, and it was literally the same day. So one would move and then the other would take up the other roost, and they were calling across the lake, presumably to females, but there was a sort of territory approach to this which you haven't found before from these species. The bats, we found bats who were switching roosts more frequently and using roost resources differently to how we previously thought they were using them. We also found that even small mitigating measures can have a big effect. The system can detect the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of mitigation as well, which is really beneficial to when you've got these big projects and you need to make little tweaks on site. We did find that the bats move out to the wider landscape and use other resources during levels of disturbance. This is only really possible if there are other suitable resources that are connected for them to move out to. So we started to look at this as a much more of a collective roost and landscape resource for the population. The rate of roost switching was so much higher, and the collective roosting resources just seem really, really important for those single maternity roost features, which we quite often focus on. And this perhaps should start informing how we look at conservation and protection of bats, and for mitigation projects on larger scales like this. So in summary, better data, better conclusions and inferences and decision making. With less costs and less people hours to obtain all of this information, so that's a real plus. Reduction in nighttime work and people on construction site, and it's a really robust tool to provide a standardized approach along these large or long-term projects where we want to do this type of monitoring, and it has the potential to really start informing our conservation and impact assessments, as well as how we determine how effective the mitigation is. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris and Charlotte. That was really, really interesting. We do have time for a couple questions. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm very interested at the start. What's the spatial scale or distance over which tracking works?
The question is, what is the spatial scale or the distance that the tracking system will detect bats?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question, and it varies based on the topography and things like that. But for the system as a whole, we were sampling an area of about 850 hectares with the system as a whole. The system works more accurately the shorter the distance between the aerials, but we found, I think it was about 500 meters.
We had, yeah, our aerials were 500 to 800 meters apart, depending on where they were.
But there's so much about the topography and the site itself that affects it. So we found we had aerials that were 300 meters apart, and they would rarely talk to each other. So there was a lot of learning that went into this as we sort of initially designed and tested it, and then had to react and move things around to find the right sort of scale. But yeah, sort of between 500 and 800 meters between the logger stations.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Oh, thank you. Yes, yeah, please.
I'm wondering what other species could be tracked using this kind of technology.
Right. So the question is, what other species could be tracked using this technology?
So the manufacturers have tried out lots of other species. So they've used it on waterfalls. Did they say lemmings as one of them?
European hamsters, the Asian hornet, which is an invasive species in Europe, birds as well. Yeah. So yeah, terrestrial mammals, birds. I think people have also used it on reptiles as well.
Yeah, and we're currently looking into whether we can use it on badgers for some badger radio tracking in the UK as well.
Cool. That was a great question, because I was curious about that too, because you guys got such great data out of that. We have 2 more questions. Go ahead, please.
So we were talking about badgers. So this device, would that work if the animal goes underground, or would the signal just cease once it goes subterranean?
Yeah, great question. So the question was about badgers specifically, which is not what you study, but perhaps you have some insight into this. Would the signal be able to detect the animals when they go underground? Can they get a subterranean signal, or would you lose it at that point?
I would highly doubt they would get much of a viable signal from that. I mean, the signal would have to reflect off the substrate and then be picked up by the aerials. I would imagine it's only going to be useful when the badgers are active above ground, moving around. And the same for watervoles and things like that as well, that also live in burrows. I mean, never say never. Using this system surprised us, and a lot happened that we weren't expecting. So you never know, but I wouldn't count on it.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what new innovations there are for these data. And yeah, please go ahead.
How long do the tags stay on the bat?
How long do the tags stay on the bats?
So the way we stick the tags on, it very much depends what time of the season it is. So they can stay on for probably up to a month, because what we do is we sort of trim the hair down, and we then glue them on, and then as the fur grows through, it pushes the tag off. Also, it depends on the type of bat. So if you're getting bats that are grooming a lot in the colonies, especially at maternity sort of time season, so brown long-eared bats in our country, they tend to groom them off quite quickly. Slightly what we call dirtier bats, so the Daubenton's, they stay on a little bit longer because they don't groom themselves as much. So it sort of depends, but I would say up to a month. So 2 weeks to a month is how long they'd stay on, but the battery dies sort of before that. And also when we tag in the maternity season, we tend not to put too much glue on, and we don't take the fur too short because we want them to fall off before the pups are born.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for your presentation. And thanks for joining us from the UK, and have a great night. And we appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So our next speaker is Shawn Kiernan. He is a student with Caesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M in Kingsville. And he will be talking on landscape connectivity and spatial ecology for an endangered carnivore, how ocelots move near transportation infrastructure.
All right, can you all hear me? Sweet. So my name is Shawn Kiernan, and today I'm a master's student at Texas A&M Kingsville, and today I'll be presenting on some of my master's thesis work, some preliminary data that I have, and it's titled Small Steps, Big Barriers, How Elusive South Texas Felids Interact with Roads. So I want to start out by introducing some of the felids of South Texas. And I want to start by looking at the bobcat. And the bobcat has a short bobtail with ear tufts, and they're considered a generalist species and are widespread throughout North America. And within North America, they occupy a bunch of different habitats, including in South Texas, where they occur in high densities. And then in South Texas, they coexist with the ocelot, and the ocelot has a bold rosette pattern and slender build, and both of these cats are medium-sized. But the ocelot is a thorn scrub specialist in South Texas, and specifically the Tamaulipan thorn scrub, and it's characterized by vertical and horizontal cover, and basically if you can't walk through it, then that's where you most likely find ocelots. And they're federally endangered, and there's less than 100 individuals left in the wild in the US, and this population is over 100 miles away from the nearest population in Mexico. So it's pretty isolated, and the thorn scrub areas are in two distinct areas that we like to call the ranch population and the refuge population. And the ranch population is characterized by private ranches, and the refuge is Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge in South Texas. And I want to talk a little bit about the expansion of humans in South Texas. And you can see just how big of a increase that we're expected to see in South Texas. And specifically, this is the Rio Grande Valley metropolitan area. And there's 3 different cities that combine to form this area. And the dark green is the thorn scrub, which is more woody and oak habitats that are mixed in with it. And this is where you're most likely to find the ocelots. And as the expansion keeps growing, you'll see less and less thorn scrub that these specialists require. So I'll take a look at my study area. So my study area is in purple here. These are my 3 field sites. And I want to point out quickly, the refuge is here. And so this is where I'll be referring to as the refuge population. And then up here is the ranch population of ocelots. And I also want to point out just exactly where we are in South Texas and on the US map. And then these 3 red circles are road stretches that I'm particularly interested in. And down here we have FM 106, and this is a potential area, an ecologically important road stretch for ocelots. And in particular, it has potential to become an ecological trap as ocelots will be moving closer towards the development. And then we also have SH 186 up here in the center, and this one is bisecting both of the populations in half. And then finally, we have US 77, which is a divided highway, and it has the potential for, in the future, for when or if ocelots are able to move west of 77 and occupy available thorn scrub. And this over here on the right is what it looks like. So I want to talk in more detail about these 3 highways. And so State Highway 186 is SH 186, and that's the one that bisects both populations. Farm to Market 106 is the one near the refuge population, and US Highway 77 is where the potential conflict could be in the future. And I want to take a look and compare some of these, and we can see that the annual average daily traffic rating, or AADT, from the years of my study is very similar across FM 106 and SH 186. And these are both roads that are 2-lane roads with single lanes in both directions. And some of the major differences of them is the speed limit. FM 106 has a speed limit that's less, and it also has an array of roads around it because it's closer to the population center, whereas SH 186 is by itself. And then also I want to point out that FM 106 has road crossing sites specifically built for ocelots on it, which could help the movement across these barriers. And then US Highway 77 is our most unique, and you can see it has 2 lanes in both directions, 10 times the AADT of the other 2, and high speed limit. And I also want to point out on this road that they have a huge grassy median, and this could be a refuge area for cats that are potentially crossing the road. And you can see it's full of oaks and mesquites. and horizontal cover for the cats, so they could easily bed down in there. So how do these 3 roads impact our cats? Well, directly, there are, of course, mortalities and habitat loss and fragmentation, but indirectly, it can cause behavioral disruption and increased stress for these cats. Potentially in the future, it can also cause a reduction in gene flow and a reduction of habitat connectivity. And I talked a little bit earlier about the ecological traps where a cat could cross over the road and then be stuck in an area that can't support it. And also human activity increase. So as roads are built in an area, more humans come in and could develop even further. So today I really want to focus on behavioral disruption and the behavioral impacts of these barriers. So my question for you all for the project is, how do roads influence these movement patterns, and what extent do they act as barriers? So some of my objectives for today are to quantify how these roads influence the movement decisions, and then also evaluate the permeability of the road landscape, and look at it sort of like a matrix. So some of the methods. So for this in particular, I used 13 collared bobcats from a 3 years period across 3 different field sites, and their collars, they were fitted with collars with 1 hour constant fixed rates. And this resulted in almost 50,000 GPS telemetry locations. And I focused on cats that were in close proximity, specifically within 300 meters of a paved road. And I performed a barrier behavior analysis. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what a barrier behavior analysis actually is. And so basically what it is an individual level categorization method based off of space and time. So it takes into account how long a cat has been within the buffer of the barrier. And for this in particular was 300 meters. So once it gets in the 300 meter buffer zone, then what does it do? And it defines the behaviors that the points are showing. So in particular, it gives 3 big categories, and it is normal, altered, and trapped movements. And there are quick movements, and these are the quick cross and the bounce. These movements are quick. They're coming into contact for a little bit. And then the average movements is interesting because it takes into account a lot of the past movements, and it'll say what like line straightness and turn angles, and calculate if it's an average movement and not affected at all by the barrier. And then altered movements include some of the back and forth and trace. And these movements can become trapped if they're there for a longer duration. So it's sort of a gradient going down. And I want to get into, before I get into the results of the barrier behavior analysis, I want to get into a little bit of the crossing data and the crossing results. So if you can see up here, I want to point out first that we had over 300 instances of crossings from male bobcats, and we had 8 males and 5 females. So, and then for the females, we had only 16 crossings. So there's a big difference there. And then also I wanted to point out the bobcat HB729233 male, or as I'll call him, HB33 male. And he actually had a higher crossing rate, had more number of crossings than the number of events. And this is possible because the event starts when he comes into the 300 meter barrier. And if he spends a long time, he can cross this road multiple times during this event. And it is, in particular, this cat had multiple events that were over 20 hours long, and even had a couple events, or had one event in particular that was 34 hours long. So he stayed within the buffer zone for 34 hours and crossed the road multiple times. So this is the reason you see his number being so high. And then also I wanted to point out this bobcat, LV727047, and this cat had the most number of events and number of crossings. And this was because it went right up to an offshoot off of FM 106 that is near developments, and it's a smaller road that is easier to cross for the animal, and he would cross it on a nightly basis almost. And now I want to group these up by road section. So in particular, and I also added a new column called average duration. So this is the average time of each event. And so I wanted to point out SH186 in particular, and it has the lowest crossing rate and also the longest average events. So this shows the highest like barrier strength. And then, well, all right, I hope it will in my analyses. And then US 77 seems to be skewed higher with the crossing rate, but the average duration is actually lower than 186 or higher than FM 106, which is kind of the intermediate road. So here are the barrier behavior analysis results. And I want to point out in particular with FM 106, it had the shortest duration on the last slide. So it was, you would hope to see more bounce movements and quick crosses. And that's exactly what we see here. So the quicker behavior types are being seen more often on this cat. And then also SH186 showed the most signs of barrier effects on the last slide. And you can now see that we did end up seeing a lot of bounce and the least amount of normal events, or the average and quick cross in green. And then finally, we have US 77, which for being the biggest road has the largest number of these normal events and least number of bounce events, but it actually could be a double-edged sword, and it has the most number of trapped events. But I think this is pretty skewed by the cat that I was talking about earlier, an HB33 male. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about his results in general. And this is his graph. And you can see almost 50% of his events were these normal events. So when he comes in within 300 meters of a road, almost 50% of the time, he's not being affected. And then he does end up having a lot of trap movements, but there could be a lot of potential reasons for this. And I was trying to think of some, and he's actually a younger male when we caught him. So I want to point out, I have a video of some of his movements. And in this, you'll see he kind of starts down here on the right and works his way up. And this is taken from a week of his movements. And in this week period, he crosses the road a lot of times. It's hard to even count. And he crosses the road a lot of times and stays in close proximity. And it seems to me like he got kicked out of this territory and is trying to find new territory. But maybe he has found a way as well. We'll see it. He has sort of short bursts during the night where he crosses quickly, and then during the day it seems like he stays within the median or on one of the sides of the road. So I'll play this now. And yeah, he ends up going all the way around and ending back where he started a week later. And these movements are extremely interesting to me, and maybe could show some behavioral plasticity that occurs in our bobcats. So here are some more final results that I had. And in particular, so these are classified based off normal, altered, and trapped. And the normal behaviors are these quick crosses and average movements where they're not being affected. And the altered are the bounce, trace, and back and forth movements. So in areas where you'll see more green, there's less of a barrier effect. And then in areas where you see more red and orange, there's more altered behavior. And in particular, if you look at SH186, the east portion of it seems to have a better connectivity and is more permeable to the cats than this western section. And then if we look at FM 106 in the center, you can see that the cats are tending to cross this smaller road that runs north to south rather than FM 106, which runs sort of through the area. And it would be interesting in the future to see if I get more cats that are actually alongside this road to see if this will change. And then US 77 is kind of skewed again by HB33 male, but you can still see there's a lot of orange and red along the sides of it. So with more future work and research, I'm hoping that these results and future results can help guide placements of wildlife crossings, fencings, and speed reduction areas. And hopefully it can also provide some context for genetic findings that we have. So if there's evidence of a reduction of gene flow, that my results will back that up. And then it also can help detect some at-risk populations, especially with the ocelots in areas of isolation. and look at some individual variation in behavioral plasticity that I was mentioning earlier. And in the future, I want to replicate these methods for the rest of our historical bobcat data set, which uses a variety of different fixed rates, and see if we see the same trends that we're seeing right now with just this smaller data set. And I also want to replicate this for ocelots and compare and contrast these results to bobcats and see if there's a difference between the specialists and generalists. And I also want to pair these findings with other genetic research that people in my lab are doing, and see if our results complement each other very well. And this season just ended for trapping, but we had over 30 bobcats and 20 ocelots, and at least half of these were within a kilometer of the road. So it could be a lot more data for me in the future. And I also will be continuing my master's and identify some of the road, and I hope to identify and compare road crossing sites versus roadkill sites and see why there's success and not successful and unsuccessful in crossing roads. So I want to acknowledge Texas Department of Transportation. They've funded my project, and also the graduate students, undergraduates, and research technicians that helped collect data. And my contact info is in the bottom left, and I want to leave it with the video of a bobcat that we recaptured earlier in the season. And then I'll take any questions. Yeah. Makes it look easy running through the thorn scrub. Yes. Any questions? Yes, in the back.
So, looking at the roads, I would have thought that Highway 77 would have been the toughest cross. But if you have that one cat excluding your data,
Mhm.
look at the data excluding that cat, and is it harder to cross, or do you think there's a reason that it's easier to cross than some of the other smaller roads?
So two answers to that. I can repeat the question too. So he was wondering, he had a question about US 77. We would expect it to be easier to cross than the smaller roads. And he was wondering if it was skewed that heavily and if we looked at it without that cat in it. And my answer to that is I haven't looked at it without the cat in it yet, but I plan to do that. And once I incorporate the rest of my data set as well, I want to see how it looks fully, and then without that cat in particular. But it also brings up a good question of whether we include only transient individuals or individuals that don't have a home range set, and see the difference between cats that are more likely to cross roads and explore new areas. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah. Yes.
Possibly a related question is, I'm wondering about, do you know whether when they're making these road crossing movements, is it always that great, or are they also incorporating perhaps some drainage structures in those movements, like culverts, existing culverts?
Mm-hmm. So she was asking about whether if they're just crossing right over the road or using culverts. And there are culverts, and I think that is a factor of it, especially at FM 106, where there are road crossing structures and built for cats specifically, and I think they are using those pretty heavily. But in most of these cats, I want to, in the future, overlay with the road crossing structures and see if those areas in particular we're seeing a correlation of, oh, yes, there's less barrier effects in that certain area. Yeah.
Do you think the road with the divided median that's vegetated, and you showed the video of what appeared to be moving parallel within that median? Do you think that median is serving as a safe haven or as an ecological trap for cats to be with the roadkill data around those areas to see if there's higher instances?
Yeah, I think so. The question was whether the median areas, so especially on US 77 where it's divided, whether I think that these areas are ecological traps and or if they're providing refuge for the cats. And I think that kind of a mixed bag, a bit of both. I think they are providing refuge, especially some of the cats that are learning to sort of hunker down during the daytime and take use of the cover. But I also think that, especially that cat in particular, he was being trapped inside and he kind of was just going back and forth trying to find a safe place to cross and failing. But I also think there's a couple other theories too, and I think that potentially there's some untapped prey availability that could be in the median of the road. It sounds weird, but it's thick enough, and I know it might be something where they come in periodically. But yeah, I don't really know quite yet, but great question.
Thank you, Shawn.
Yes, thank you.
If you have more questions for Shawn, please find him after the session. Our next speaker is Brielle Jaglowski, and she is a student at Cal Poly Humboldt, and she is going to be talking on factors influencing elk road crossing behavior. Hi everyone, I'm Brielle and I'm currently a master's student at Cal Poly Humboldt, and today I'll be sharing a portion of my research focusing on the factors that are associated with elk road crossing behavior. So this study focuses on elk in northwestern California in particular, and these elk are vulnerable to incidents with vehicle collisions. Due to the high volume of tourism-related traffic on these highways, it's very close to Redwood National and State Parks. In addition, there are increasing elk numbers in many of the herds in these areas. So as densities are increasing, the risk with vehicle collisions also increases. In addition, there is a lot of preferred elk habitat on either side of US 101 in this area. So as you're driving on this highway, it's not an uncommon sight to see a photo like this, where the elk are just grazing a few feet away from the highway for hours at a time. And it's actually been identified as one of the main types of human-elk conflict in the area is this risk with vehicle collisions. So since the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I'll refer to as CDFW, has been recording causes of elk mortality in the area, there have been a reported 87 elk vehicle collisions since 2017, and this equates to about 1 collision every month, although this is likely underrepresented as a lot of collisions go unreported. And one of the main ways to mitigate this risk with vehicle collisions is through wildlife crossing systems, which have been proven to reduce collisions with large mammals anywhere from 80 to 97%. And these systems are generally quite costly, so it's very important to consider where they're placed. So this begs the question in this area of where are the elk crossing the most and what factors are associated with these crossings so we can choose the best spots to place these systems. And that led me to develop my main research objective, which was to evaluate how various environmental and structural factors are associated with female elk road crossing probability in northwestern California. And I focused on female elk in particular, since they're the main drivers of herd movement, and we also didn't have any male elk collar data available, so it worked out. And my main hypothesis with this objective was that female elk road crossing probability would be higher in areas that elk are primarily foraging, which is generally open grassland habitat, as well as areas that can act as natural movement corridors for elk, including riparian areas and secondary roads, as well as areas of lower perceived risk, which can be thought of as a fewer number of highway lanes or areas with bridges where the elk can actually move under the highway. So to give you a better idea of the study area, I have northwestern California projected on this map here. And you can see the black line running through it north to south is US 101. And this black line is bisecting several orange polygons, which represent 15 different elk home ranges that are known to overlap with the highway in this area. And I'll note that the herds in Del Norte and Humboldt County, the more northern herds, contain elk of the Roosevelt elk subspecies, And then the herds down in Mendocino are Thule elk, which are a slightly smaller subspecies. And all of the elk in this region are unique in that they're non-migratory. Since they live in this comfortable coastal climate, they don't have any needs to move throughout seasons. So my analyses relied on GPS collar data, and CDFW routinely collars female elk in the area for routine management and research purposes. So the data that I used weren't collected specifically for my study, but CDFW will opportunistically free-range dart elk and place GPS collars on them. And I used data from 44 female elk, and these elk all crossed US 101 at least once during the study period, which ranged from December 2016 to December 2024. And these collars collected fixed points at different rates from 1 hour to 6.5 hours. So this resulted in a little over 200,000 GPS points. And what I did is I put the points into GIS and connected consecutive points with lines to represent the GPS steps of each individual. And what you see here is the individuals grouped by herd, represented by different colors and names on the map. And you can see US 101 represented by this white line here. And you can see that different herds interact with the highway differently. So herds like Red Schoolhouse or Big Lagoon have a lot more overlap with the highway than these herds like Little Lake and Shamrock. So my analyses focused on road crossing locations in particular, and how did I decide where these animals cross the road? Let's say we have our hypothetical female elk walking across the landscape. She eventually crosses US 101. That collar she's wearing is collecting GPS fixed points at defined intervals. And then I drew lines to connect consecutive fixed points. And at that point where the GPS step intersects with US 101, I considered the inferred crossing location for the individual. So I repeated this process across all individuals, and then input these data into a resource selection function, or RSF. And an RSF relies on both used and available points. So in this case, I used my use locations were those known crossing events, represented by this blue dot here. And available points were randomly sampled within each individual's weighted autocorrelated kernel density estimate home range. And that's represented by the blue polygon. So I only generated available points within the portion of the highway that's within the animal's home range. So the available points were generated at a 10-to-1 ratio with the use points, which are represented by those red dots. And I repeated this process for all individuals and then split the data into 80% and 20% and used 80% of the data to build the model and the remaining 20% to evaluate its predictive performance. I considered a slew of different factors in my model, mostly based on expert opinion and factors found in similar literature. And these factors included distance to forest edge, secondary road, rangeland, urban area, stream, as well as canopy cover, terrain ruggedness index, and slope. And I also considered 2 structural variables related to the highway, including the number of lanes and the presence or absence of a bridge structure. And before inputting these layers into the model, I wanted to take into account roadside characteristics. So this is a satellite image of a portion of my study area with US 101 running through this heavily forested area. And if I were to extract the value for canopy cover at this hypothetical road crossing location, I'd get a value at or near 0. But if you look at the area directly around the highway, it's not really representative of that surrounding habitat. So to account for this, as well as to account for inherent errors in estimation of that road crossing location, since this likely isn't the exact spot the elk crossed, I calculated the mean within a 100-meter diameter buffer around each point. And with that, the layers were almost ready to model. I first assessed for correlations, unsurprisingly found that ruggedness, and slope were highly correlated. So I decided to drop slope since ruggedness had more biological significance based on similar studies. I also included interaction terms for distance to stream and presence of bridge, distance to rangeland and ruggedness, and canopy cover and distance to rangeland. I also included random intercepts to account for differences in individual ID and herd, and used the top model to spatially predict across all major highways in the study area near known elk herd locations. I then evaluated the predictive performance of the model using the Boyce index, and I used that 20% of data that I had set aside from before to evaluate it. So just some basic results here. I inferred a total of 3,602 road crossing events across the whole study period, and found that individuals crossed US 101 an average of 52 times per year. However, this ranged from 1 crossing per year to 177 crossings per year. There was a lot of variability by individual. And this equates to individuals crossing US 101 about once every 6 to 7 days. However, the herds that crossed most frequently were crossing an average of once every 2 days. And this shows the distribution of those crossing densities. So you can see areas with more crossings represented in the red and the orange segments. So some of the main hotspots were just south of Crescent City and south of Oric and a bit north of Oric as well. There was one main top model that no other models were considered competitive with. So I proceeded with this model as the top model for the rest of the analyses. And this model contained all variables, but none of the interaction terms. So to give you a better idea of the patterns associated with these predictor variables, I'm going to quick run through the partial response plots for each variable. And these are all unscaled for easier interpretation. And the gray shading is representative of 95% confidence intervals. So here we can see that higher relative road crossing probability for female elk was associated with areas closer to streams, closer to rangeland, and farther from urban areas, as well as that lower ruggedness, higher canopy cover, farther from forests, and also in the presence of bridges across more lanes and farther from secondary roads. And here are the 2 first maps from those spatial predictions based on that top model. And you can see higher relative crossing probability represented in red and lower crossing probability represented in blue. And these represent the most northern part of my study area, and then southern Del Norte and northern Humboldt counties on the right. And you can see that some of these areas like south of Crescent City and around Oric also line up with those crossing hotspots I showed on the previous maps. And then here are the maps for north central Humboldt and Mendocino counties. And I focused these maps on areas where there are elk herds known to directly overlap with the highway or are adjacent to the highway, so that Caltrans and CDFW can focus on these areas for priority mitigation efforts. So the top predictor variable was distance to stream, and this is likely because riparian areas can be used as corridors for travel, as well as providing cover and forage opportunities for elk. However, riparian areas are also associated with thicker vegetation, somewhat rugged terrain, which can obstruct both the driver's and the elk's view when trying to cross the road. So this can be targeted as a priority area to help increase habitat connectivity. And as a lot of fish passage efforts are already being constructed in some areas, it would be useful to consider other animals like elk in these construction efforts to help increase connectivity across more species. And unsurprisingly, the second strongest predictor variable was open rangeland habitat, which, like I said earlier, is where elk primarily forage. And I will note that as much as I'd like to answer the question, why did the elk cross the road? My models don't quite get at that answer. It may be that they're just selecting for habitat that they would normally select for, and it's not necessarily where they prefer to cross the road the most. You'd have to run different models to get a better answer for that question. And one of the strongest structural variables that I included was the presence of a bridge, and found that there was higher crossing probability closer to these bridge sites. And since GPS collar data isn't telling you whether elk are crossing over or under the road, I spent last summer deploying cameras on all bridges and large underpasses in the study area to confirm if elk were actually crossing over or under the highway in those areas. So I was able to confirm the use of 5 bridge sites by elk successfully crossing under and through the bridge. They did not cross under any of the larger culverts in the study area. And I am looking forward to analyzing those camera data more to see what factors are associated with elk using these underpasses, so that underpasses can be modified to encourage more elk use in the future. In addition, there might be this aspect of seasonality going on, since just anecdotally, this camera, for example, when I went to pick it up at the end of the season, it was nearly under 4 feet of water, and I actually had to swim to retrieve it. And just a few weeks later, we did have an elk vehicle collision reported on the highway just above this location. So there might be a maximum water depth at which elk are choosing to no longer cross under the bridge, but instead going over and around. So that's a really interesting area of future research I'd like to look into. And then just to wrap it all up, I'm hoping that these results will be useful for Caltrans and CDFW to highlight priority areas to install crossing systems like underpasses. And I'll quick point out that the location of this photo here is actually going to be the site of a new crossing system going into place later this year, which will involve dynamic messaging signs, communicating with transceivers and GPS collars to hopefully alert drivers to elk on or near the roadway. And hopefully all of these efforts will work to reduce vehicle collision risk, increase safety for humans and elk, and also increase habitat connectivity. And I'd just like to quick thank Caltrans and CDFW for their tremendous financial support, and CDFW for all of the field efforts that went into making this project possible, as well as everybody else that helped with the methodology and analyses that went into it. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Have access to any wild people with your model.
Yes, so the question was about if I have access to wildlife vehicle collision data, and I do. So that's actually the next step in this modeling process, is I'm going to plot those vehicle collision occurrences across that spatial projection I showed to see how that lines up with relative crossing probability, and also develop a similar model using just those wildlife vehicle collision data and see what factors are associated with those. Yes.
Is there any current fencing in those locations?
Yes, so the question was if there's any current fencing in these locations. The answer is that there's very limited elk-proof fencing in these areas. Elk-proof fencing has to be very high in order for the elk not to go over it. And it only occurs over a very small stretch of my study area. So I didn't incorporate it as a factor into any of my modeling just because there was such limited data. Did that answer your question, Philly?
Picture shows.
Yeah, they can handle these 3-foot fences very easily.
Sorry if I missed something. I was curious what the traffic volume is and if it's consistent across that whole stretch of the commercial.
Yes, so the question was about traffic volume and if it's consistent across the stretch of highway that I looked at. So traffic volume varies between 150 vehicles averaged annual daily traffic volume. Across those most remote stretches, up to about 44,000 vehicles in the more populated areas. I did do a whole separate modeling process to look at traffic volume and traffic speed, as well as time of day, and found that traffic volume and speed were not significant factors in predicting elk road crossing. My best guess is that the elk in this area are just so habituated to humans and traffic volume. Like you saw in some of these pictures of them hanging out right by the highway, they don't seem to be strongly influenced by changes in traffic volume. Yes.
The herds that were crossing more or less, are there any association between that and cluster structures, like where herds were crossing more when they were?
Yeah, so the question was about if the herds that crossed the most were associated with existing crossing structures. I found that the 3 herds that crossed the most were not any that had bridges in that area. It's more so just these herds that CDFW has identified as being more habituated to human presence in traffic. The herd that crossed the 4th most is one that had a bridge site, so they crossed a little bit more frequently. Thank you so much, Brielle. Thank you, everyone. So our final speaker this afternoon is Jill Randall with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and she is speaking on the use of GPS collar data to plan and prioritize wildlife crossing projects in Wyoming, a case study of the Carter Mountain pronghorn herd.
Thanks for sticking around. I really thought the crowd would maybe be a little more dwindled given the time of day and that I'm holding you guys from beer 30, but thanks for being here. My name is Jill Randall. I'm the Big Game Migration Coordinator for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and I am excited to talk to you about a case study with our Carter Mountain pronghorn herd. So our department has a rich history of using GPS collar data to really help inform conservation practices on the ground. We put a lot of stock, a lot of weight in our GPS collar studies that we've done throughout the state. We use them for anything from planning conservation easements, fence modifications, cheatgrass treatments, all sorts of different conservation actions on the ground to really help us prioritize where to put those limited funds that we have. We also use that GPS collar data to help inform where we designate migration corridors. This is a formal process that's established through our Wyoming Migration Corridor Protection Executive Order. Like the other Western states, we were fortunate enough to acquire some additional funding for GPS collar work through Secretarial Order 3362. During 2018 and 2019, we were able to put collars out in 6 additional herds that we did not have either any data or adequate data. 3 of those are pronghorn herds and 3 of those were mule deer herds. You'll notice the northwest green polygon, that is the Carter Mountain pronghorn herd that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this talk. So this Carter Mountain pronghorn herd has approximately 6,300 individuals. It's a mix of public and private land on the east side of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. They summer in the west portion of the herd in the Absaroka Mountains, and then in the winter they move down to the Bighorn River in their lower elevation winter ranges. We had 128 pronghorn collared from 2019 to 2022 that we used for this study. The objectives were pretty broad, pretty general, really just to understand seasonal use and migration habitat. We didn't have any data in this particular herd prior to this collaring effort. So we were able to partner with West to collect a great amount of data, learning an awful lot of just natural history components of this herd. They migrate between 40 and 60 miles. Phenomenally, they are very unique in that some of them will travel 6,000 vertical feet in elevation between their winter and summer range. So that is meaning that they're summering, the portion of the migratory herd, some of them are summering over 10,000 feet in what we consider an alpine habitat. Very unusual for pronghorn to be doing that. And they are also coexisting with the full suite of natural predators, including grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves. So we've got tough pronghorn in Wyoming. But it's kind of interesting, like many of our other pronghorn herds, we realize that their migrations are a lot less predictable than mule deer. That means both spatially as well as temporally. This particular group of animals that we did have over 800,000 GPS points on was determined to be about 50% migratory. 25% are residents, and then another 25% are nomadic. Those residents and nomadic individuals really are on the east side of the herd, down around what we consider winter year-long habitat. So we did our standard modeling process to determine corridors, and that is a line buffer method using 300-meter buffers. We determined high, medium, and low use portions of this corridor by looking at the different percentages of individuals that are using those areas of the corridor. We also determined stopover areas based on a Brownian bridge movement model analysis. Again, that's the standard that we're using across all species in Wyoming to determine stopover sites. And it's getting at the top 10% of utilization distribution values for those individual routes. Not a surprise, they're also highly overlapping with our high use areas. In this project, we also determined winter habitat, patrician habitat, and some of the year-round habitat that I'm not going to go into for today's talk. It's long been understood that pronghorn require wide open landscapes to move between seasonal habitats, and those connected habitats can have a lot of different barriers and obstacles within them. Some of those being roadways, railways, or railroads, and fences. We do have an awful lot of woven wire fence, sheep fence, if you would, that was on our landscape historically in Wyoming. And as our sheep producers, a number of them have converted over to cattle. We have also been working towards converting some of those fences to provide more access to pronghorn. In this particular study, we didn't focus on fences as much, but more so roadways. And we were really looking at where those animals are crossing 4 major highways within the project area. So I'm going to have a series of maps that I want to show you. Again, these were all generated through our partnership with West and Dr. Hall Sawyer. And we also received an interactive HTML, which is a really awesome resource for our managers that can go in and kind of manipulate particular pieces of ground that they're interested in. If they really want to zoom in on a project area opposed to the whole herd, we can go in and kind of manipulate the different data sets in there. So definitely encourage you to look into using those. They're a pretty awesome resource for managers. The first thing I want to present on here is the total number of crossings by milepost. So I mentioned we've got all these individuals, we've got all these data points, which of course were connected with lines. And every time those lines cross the road, we identified those hot spots, again, using high, medium, and low kind of heat maps. That's what you'll see demonstrated with the different colors here. So the high being red, medium orange, low green, and those blue areas had 0 crossings in them. So these are showing us some of those important crossing points by milepost. Because we had a few individuals that were hanging out near the road, our data was getting a little bit skewed by a couple individuals that were crossing repeatedly. So we also looked at the data a little bit different, looking at the number of individuals that crossed by milepost opposed to the individual crossings. It was just another way for us to kind of sort out the data because we didn't want to be biasing it for some of our questions by those individuals that were hanging out right along the road. The next component was something that I was really excited about. I think, not to say it hasn't been done anywhere else, but this is one of the more intensive efforts in Wyoming that we looked at using our GPS collar data to determine where on the road movements were either stalled or blocked. So by looking at locations within 300 meters of the road, we were able to determine those areas where a collared individual was coming to the road and staying there in that buffered area opposed to crossing right across. Those areas were done independently on each side of the road because we know there are certain variables like fence design, topography, vegetation that could be allowing movement much more readily from one side of the road opposed to the other. So you'll see on the map, there's two different colors that are opposed to each other to each of those mile markers on the map. Likewise, we also decided to look at individuals opposed to the crossing events, or I'm sorry, the events of approaching the road. We also wanted to avoid some of those biases by those individuals that they're hanging out roadside. So we just choose to look at the data in a couple different ways. Again, getting that high, medium, and low categories on both of the different sides of the road. So when we were able to look at all of that data collectively, we really wanted to bring in that additional layer of looking at our wildlife vehicle collision data that we collect in partnership with the Wyoming Department of Transportation. In Wyoming, more than 7,600 ungulates are killed per year that are documented. I know we've all probably heard a couple times today. We know that number is grossly underestimating reality. And the cost associated with those documented mortalities is around $200 million annually. So in this project area, the wildlife vehicle collisions are increasing about 6% per year. Unfortunately, our pronghorn population is not. So this means as time goes on, a larger and larger percent of the mortality in the herd is actually attributed to wildlife vehicle collisions annually. In this particular project area, looking at all of our wildlife vehicle collision data, 63% is from mule deer. That's common in Wyoming for mule deer to be the highest percentage. 16% was from pronghorn, 15% white-tailed deer, and 6% from elk. So we certainly have multiple species interacting here in this landscape and all playing a role in the wildlife vehicle collision data. The thing that caught our attention is that the percent of pronghorn wildlife vehicle collisions was more than about twice our state average. So it caught our attention when we were looking specifically at conservation of this particular pronghorn herd. Those traffic volumes is another component that we looked at. You'll see on the graph here on the left, the traffic volume on this particular stretch of road has greatly increased from 1970 through recent times. This area is right outside of Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park, receives an awful lot of vehicle traffic by tourists, and that traffic and volume level obviously has gone up dramatically. We are pretty concerned about this particular area and what this traffic volume increase means for those gaps between vehicles in our roadway system. So in areas where you have less than 60 seconds gap between vehicles, we see that there's a reluctance for animals to even attempt to cross the road. So we're approaching that threshold where we might be getting a barrier and animals might be they're stopping to attempt those crossings, which is certainly not good when we have a highly migratory herd that we looked at here earlier. So as we're approaching that threshold, it kind of created a sense of urgency for the agency to try to find a solution. So in Wyoming, we have been fortunate enough to go through a prioritization process that was started after 2017 Wildlife Roadway Summit. And in this process, we really looked at a lot of different inputs as far as wildlife vehicle collisions, the feasibility of solutions for different priority areas. You know, unfortunately, we all know there's some areas that have a lot of collisions, but there really just isn't an immediately feasible solution, even if money is not in play. But the fact that we were able to develop a top 10 list is something that we've kind of worked on. And that top 10 list is not the smaller projects that are happening throughout the state. These are the big projects that are requiring, for example, federal funding to come in, projects with overpasses, underpasses, et cetera. We can only take on so many of those based on the funding capacity component. So we've prioritized. On that top 10 list, fortunately, a number of them have been already implemented. We have another one that's fully funded, ready to be implemented. And then we have 2 others that are planned, that we have a project ready to go, Du Bois being one of them. And we're actively trying to solicit federal funding for those. So we have this next top 3, if you would. This project area is in the top 3 for developing the solutions on the ground. We're looking at 3 different projects that are spatially spread out across the state, have very different kind of strategies and approaches. But right now, what we're doing is working with our local game and fish people and our local Department of Transportation folks that know that area, looking at the data that we have like this to feed into developing those solutions. In this particular area, we know that most of the pronghorn are crossing in 2 locations. And so overpasses will be proposed in probably both of those. Overpasses, whether we're able to do 1 or 2 will depend on our budget availability, but we now know where we need to place them based on having this data. We'll also, of course, have high fences throughout the project area and a number of underpasses to accommodate all the other wildlife species that are in play. That is what I have. So thank you very much for being here at the end of the day, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
The herd view is just request of the higher mortality rate, and then there's sometimes the state average. Does it increase availability or?
So the question was, did we determine why the higher relative abundance of wildlife vehicle collisions here compared to the statewide average? And, you know, a lot of it is the absolute necessity for these animals to cross the highway. If they're a migratory individual, you can't get from that summer range to winter range without crossing those highways. There's no roundabout path. Even though pronghorn do tend to have a fair bit of flexibility, there just isn't a way to get from point A to B without crossing highways for this particular herd. That's likely the reason why. In some other places, you know, they might have options to bubble around or avoid, you know, a barrier that they don't, or a partial barrier. But here they just don't. Yes.
That 2-mile segment of Wyoming 120, what's the present right-of-way fencing strategy along that 2 miles?
The question is, what's the current fencing along that stretch of highway? And I honestly don't know for certain. We have a big mix of fences. A lot of our highways, because of safety for motorists, are woven wire fence. I don't know 100% for certain if we have that there or if there is a mix of some wired range fence that goes through there. I suspect it's not all woven wire. Otherwise, we would be having bigger complications with crossing those highways. But we know these critters are certainly pretty creative about finding their location. They can scoot through. I know one of the things that we've talked about in the interim before we get federal funding to do the full-blown solution in several of our project areas is trying to go through and do some intermediate fence modifications. It's just hard to justify the expense of going through and doing something if you're hoping within the next 5 years you're going to put an 8-foot tall wildlife proof fence in there. You hate to kind of invest money 2 times in the same stretch of road.
Did I misinterpret your map then? It looked like they were already getting across the road.
They are getting across the road, absolutely. It's just a question of, are they finding those little gaps to squeak in and around, or are they freely able to cross because it's a 3 or 4 wire fence? And I apologize, I don't know that particular spot, what we have for the right-of-way fence there. Yeah, Andy?
Hey, Joe, this question was similar, but I was just going to ask, do you think you have the data to ground truth the fences? I mean, especially in places you have different permeability on each side of the same highway, and those are likely the same animals going back and forth. Seems like if you compare fence structure on both sides, you could use your data to help some of us that have struggled with this in places we don't have to call our animals. You know, essentially flip it around, allow us to evaluate permeability based on fences without calling them.
Yeah, so the question is there a way for us to look at those existing fences on the ground and help determine, you know, what those variables are that are either slowing down or preventing movement, to try to help inform places where we don't have color data. We're always looking to try to expand our knowledge of information, because nobody can color everywhere that they want to. That's just reality. Yes, we absolutely do have the information to be able to go in and do that. I know in some places, they felt like topography and vegetation was also at play, not just fence style. So sight lines and, you know, pronghorn in particular are very sensitive to those sight line differences. And so there's probably multiple factors at play, but we do have the information now to go in and make some of those site specific evaluations. It'd be great if it was black and white and simple, but in this world, we all know it rarely is, unfortunately. Yes.
Probably to the end. On the fence type, I'm interested, you indicated an 8-foot fence. Is this an area that is a high snow flow zone? Have you evaluated the effectiveness of the fence to stay up to the environment conditions?
So the question is the environment and snow loading something that will be feasible to have an 8-foot tall fence? Yes, this is in big snow country, but I can say firsthand, we have some places that are bigger snow country in Western Wyoming that we have had 8-foot tall fence for many years, highly effective regardless of snow loading. We haven't seen a problem. I'm not going to say that it might contribute to more maintenance over time, but we haven't found any problems with big winter snow and holding up to those conditions.
We can take one more question?
Yeah.
The mission of 300-meter buffer design, I'm just wondering why.
So the question is why 300 meters for the buffer? And the line buffer method that we're using for monitoring our corridors is determined based on some research that Dr. Jared Merkel led, that was looking at various fix rates on different individuals and trying to accommodate the variance that occurs. There's a great paper and publication I would love to get to you. I come find me afterwards, I can do that. And it really honed in on 300 meters being kind of the sweet spot. So we definitely have used that number consistently, again, across species, because it really, it set up that being the number with the research that Dr. Merkel led.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, everyone. This was a great session, a lot of great information, another great hand for our speakers and for our technical assistants here. And you're free to go. We have a reception at 6 p.m. in the Grand Ballroom, and I hope to see you there.
Great job.
We evaluate it all.